My name is Aida, and I will be your moderator for today. Thank you so much for joining us in this beautiful Tuesday morning or Monday evening to talk about God, philosophy, language, and all that fun stuff. So, we are very lucky to have this incredible thinkers and speakers joining us to help us explore these wonderful topics. And I'm sure so many of you have read the book, but if you have not, let me give you a quick overview of Arguing About Gods by Graham Opie. So, Arguing About Gods explores the various arguments for and against the existence of God. It has been translated to many languages, including Indonesian. So, do check it out. If you have any questions about the book or any of the presentations shown today, feel free to type in your questions in the chat column. And at the end of the session, we'll open up a Q&A and your questions might get answers. All right, without further ado, let me introduce our speakers for today. Number one, first we have Professor Graham Opie, the author of Arguing About Gods. He is a professor of philosophy at Monash University, specializing in the philosophy of religion. He also works on a range of other topics in epistemology, metaphysics, philosophy of language, and many others. Professor Opie, good evening, good morning. We are excited to have you with us today. Hi.
So thanks for inviting me on.
Thank you for coming. Next, we have Professor Eugene Nagasawa. He is a professor of philosophy and Kingfisher College Chair of the Philosophy of Religion and Ethics at the University of Oklahoma. He is also the editor-in-chief of Religious Studies and the principal investigator of the Global Philosophy of Religion project. Professor Nagasawa, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, and finally, we have a fellow Indonesian, Samuel Jonathan, is here with us today. He holds a master's degree in philosophy from the University of Oklahoma. He is an educator, a philosophy researcher. He's also one of the translators for Arguing About Gods into Indonesian. Hi, Sam. Excited to have you.
Yeah, thank you, Aida.
So, gentlemen, how are we doing today? Good? Glad to hear that. All right, let's dive right in. So the book is called Arguing About Gods, right? And when we talk about God, we often end up talking about translation and language because religious texts require translation. And that in itself is a complex process that would need a lot of interesting discourse and interpretation. And Professor Nagasawa, as a philosopher and professor, you write a lot about the intersections between philosophy and language and how translation shapes our understanding of philosophical thoughts. So I believe you have a presentation for us today.
Okay, so
Great.
right. So yeah, thank you so much for organizing this exciting event. I led a project called the Global Philosophy Religion Project at the University of Birmingham from 2019 to 2023, last year. And this was an international initiative to globalize and diversify the philosophy of religion. And it was supported by the John Templeton Foundation. And our ambition was to really expand the scope of the philosophy of religion, because at least in the West, the philosophy of religion has focused mainly on the Judeo-Christian concept of God. And that's because the philosophy of religion has been dominated by mainly Christian philosophers in the English-speaking part of the world. So we wanted to really expand the scope so that we can focus on religious and cultural traditions beyond the Western Christianity. And as part of the project, we supported many research projects and translation projects. And we funded Samuel's team to translate Graham's book, Arguing About Gods. And we were particularly excited for various reasons. So first, we thought that it would be great to translate this book into Indonesian, because Southeast Asia is a particularly interesting region for us because it's very religiously and culturally rich, and the population is young, and there are a lot of very educated young people who are interested in philosophical issues. And the second reason is that I believe that Graham's book, Arguing About Gods, is one of the most important books about arguments for and against God, written by an atheist slash agnostic. When I was a student, the classic book was J.L. Mackie's book called The Miracle of Theism. But that book is a little bit dated. And also Graham's book is more comprehensive, and it covers a wide range of arguments and problems about the concept of God and gods. And also personally, I have some attachment to this book because this book includes a chapter that is based on a paper that I wrote with Graham and also Nick Trakakis. So I was a student more than 20 years ago. I was a PhD student in Australia at the Australian National University. And one day Graham came to our department to give a lecture, guest talk. And we started to interact because we share research interests in the philosophy of religion. And we were particularly interested in the apparent incompatibility between the concept of heaven and the free will defense or free will theodicy as a response to the problem of evil. So our basic idea was that traditional theists believe that in heaven, people are free, they are free agents, they are morally significantly free, but at the same time, for some reason, it's guaranteed that there is eternal bliss in heaven and there is no evil in heaven. But then how come Earth is not like that? How come we are free? And often theists say that God have to grant us morally significant freedom because freedom is intrinsically good. But as an outcome of that, there is evil on Earth. But how come Earth is not like heaven? If God can create a region where people are free, but there is no free will, and we liked this kind of interesting puzzle or mystery. And so Graham included a chapter which is based on this paper, but he discusses many other interesting arguments for and against the existence of God. And I really would like to congratulate Samuel and his team, and also Graham for this book. We have a very specific timeline for our Global Philosophy Revision project. And I wasn't entirely sure that Samuel's team could translate the whole book within this time period because Graham's book is quite extensive. But I was pleasantly surprised that they really managed to publish this book in time. And also it has been very successful. So Samuel has told me that they are already producing the second print of this book. So it's really amazing. And I'm very happy to hear the success of this translation. So congratulations again. And yeah, thank you for inviting me. And I'm looking forward to Graham's talk tonight.
All right. Awesome. Thank you, Professor Nagasawa. Next, we will hear from Samuel. Sam, as a fellow Indonesian, I think this book is, as Professor Nagasawa has said, is very relevant. Indonesia is very rich in religious diversity. So how do you think this book can be relevant in the philosophical discourse in Indonesia?
Yeah, so I have a slide. So please give me the screen for a while. So before Prof. OP present his big idea of his book, I'm going to give a short presentation, maybe 10 minutes or 15 minutes, about why we decided to choose Graham OP's Arguing About God as the book that we want to translate and not the other books. So not a lot of books out there. So let me share my screen. So yeah, hope you can see it clearly. So yeah, it's just gonna be a short 15 minute talk the reason why we end up to translate Hermop's argument about God into Indonesian. So there are two things that I want to share to OP, to Professor OP, Professor Nagasawa, and maybe some of you who are not from Indonesia, and of course Indonesian as well. So I want to share about try to wait.
Can you guys hear my sound clearly right now? I
Perfect.
hope it's better compared to earlier. Okay, nice. Yeah, so two things. Basically, I want to share a bit about the state of philosophy of religion in Indonesia. And from there, I'm going to show you guys about why arguing about gods and not, again, a lot of the other books that we can pick out there. So first thing first, I'm going to be direct here. So most of the philosophers, or even most of the writings, books that written in Indonesia are predominantly theistic. So I think that's the most noticeable about philosophy of religion in Indonesia. And maybe what you know about this condition of how most of the representations of philosophers of religion in Indonesia will be either realize about it because either doing her undergrad study in STF Derkara, which is mostly the lecturers are Catholic friars, am I right? So predominantly theistic perspectives, and one of the things that I think one of the reasons is because most of the representatives of philosophy of religion in Indonesia are religious leaders. An example, one of the most notable name in Indonesia is Franz Makin Suseno. He's a Jesuit, and I could say he's one of the most well-known philosophers in Indonesia. Also, other Franz Makin Suseno, there, Franz Makis, right one down there, and then Simon Petrus Cahyade. He is also a Catholic friar, and the list goes on. Thomas Ibiachaya, and then Satyo Wibowo, and so on and so on. Mostly are Catholic friars. And other than Catholic friars, we also have Muslim scholars, right? Muslim scholars like Dr. Fahrudin Faiz or Yusuf Daud, and again, the list goes on out there. So I'm not saying there is something wrong with this religious leaders philosophizing about religion, but I'm just saying that this dominance of religious leaders make our philosophy of religion in Indonesia seems a bit stagnant, or even monolithic. That's what I thought, and that's what our team. So other than me, there are some other people as well out there, my lecturers. So we think that we won't say that it is a problem, but it makes philosophy of religion in Indonesia a bit quite of stagnant. And not only that, we also think that the prevalent approaches are often this is what we see, apologetic or focus on interfaith dialogue. The same thing earlier. I'm not saying that this is a problem in itself, but this is the only representative way to do philosophy of religion and in Indonesia. We do not know any other approaches. It's rarely for us to see another approaches in philosophy of religion in Indonesia. And the third one, I think because of those things, because of the dominance or representatives of these religious leaders, there is notable absence of representation for philosophical atheism. And there are a lot of other reasons, of course, like it's a bit risky to state yourself as an atheist in Indonesia because Indonesia is a Muslim majority country. It's not dangerous, but it's a bit risky. But in this context of academia, in this context of the discourse of philosophy of religion, we won't see notable representation of philosophical atheism because of this predominantly theistic perspectives. Antinomi Suseno wrote two notable books. The last one is more recent. It's written, published in 2023. It's Faith in Struggle, and the right one, it's a classic for Indonesian students, Reasoning God. Both of this book, I even dare to say they uncharitably present atheism. So I believe I dare to say that they uncharitably presents atheism. So on this Menalar Tuhan or Reasoning God, most of the philosophers or thinkers that presented by Antinomi Suseno, those are some very old thinkers that probably it's still discussed in this in academia, but rarely to be considered as the representation of contemporary atheism. So it mentions people like Deus Verubah or Friedrich Nietzsche, Jean-Paul Sartre, which is they were all atheists, but I do not think it's the most it's a representation of atheism for right now, contemporary. So this is what we see in the context of the state of philosophy of religion in Indonesia. And yeah, and I think they end up to make some scarecrows, and yeah, they uncharitably represent atheism. So that's one of the state of philosophy of religion in Indonesia that we see. Second, we also see the limited awareness of global developments in philosophy of religion. So we tend to focus only on the big figures, Aquinas, Feuerbach, Nietzsche, and a lot of philosophers who lived before the 20th century. 5 ways, the God is that, so on and so on, but without offering any novel interpretations. Again, it's a bit dull for me. It's a bit dull, and then it's repetitive. It's a bit tiring to hear this. Catholic friars to talk about Aquinas or Anselm. It's a bit tiring. So that's what we see, and you cannot even hear people mentions Sobel or Schellenberg or Graham Opie. We rarely even mention them. People out there mention mostly those old and big figures of philosophers. Okay, I don't think, and we don't think they represent atheism's the best version of atheism. That's what we think. So these two reasons. So this is some examples of other books. So in summary, we think the state of philosophy of religion in Indonesia is stagnant and monolithic. It's mostly or almost every philosophy of religion books in Indonesia are represents theism. Also, it's focused only on those big figures. And again, it's a bit tiring and dull, stagnant and monolithic. So this is the condition. So probably, Professor Oki and Professor Nagasawa just know about it. So, but that's the condition of philosophy of religion in Indonesia. And again, and what's next? So why agreeing about gods? Some considerations, considering that context, that state of philosophy of religion in Indonesia. So we think agreeing about gods is great book. So first thing first, it employs an analytic philosophy approach. So I'm not saying that analytic philosophy is the most superior way to do philosophy or the best way to do philosophy. We do not mean that, but in the context of Indonesian academia, most philosophers, not a lot, not every philosopher, but most philosophers doing philosophy of religion in way of continental philosophy. And again, it's based and we think arguing about gods will be interesting because it will make it a bit variative. Second, it's also represent philosophical atheism, and as one of the participants here already said, even it could be considered one of the best books that represents philosophical atheism. And even William Lane Craig said that those students of natural theology need to read this book. Either, as Professor Nagasawa said, its comprehensive scope provides critical evaluations of arguments or for God's existence, covering ontological, cosmological, theological, as well as minor arguments involving scripture, miracles, and more. So it is really comprehensive arguing about gods. And that's why we're arguing about gods. We aim to introduce global perspectives. What do we mean by global perspectives? We hope that this book could show the developments, or it could be a window to the contemporary philosophy of religion, the debates, what happens in the context of philosophy of religion globally. And we introduced the analytic philosophy approach within the context of the philosophy of religion, and later, and also our representation for philosophical atheism. So this is one of the reasons why, this is the reason why we want this book to be translated into Indonesian language. And we even hope that it could provide essential reference for philosophy students in Indonesia, particularly those interested in the philosophy of religion, because we, again, a lot of books that we read as students are mostly presenting theism, and that's why it's important to translate this book. So, in conclusion, I'm gonna end up my presentation. We hope the translation of this book, it aims to advance discourse on the philosophy of religion in Indonesia, provide global awareness, diverse approaches, and over comprehensive critical and reflective text religion and scholars. So, so I heard from the publishers right now, it has been sold 360 copies, which quite quite surprising. It's quite surprising for publishers and as well for me to see that this kind of big book could be sold more than 300 copies. And I really hope, and of course, our team, my lecturers, colleagues, really hope this could give a new color for our state of philosophy of religion in Indonesia. And we hope later in the future, we could translate with Antinomi as well, to publish the books, more diverse approaches, more diverse perspective in philosophy of religion. I think that's it, Aida and Prof. Okay, for my presentation.
Thank you, Sam. Really interesting take there on the state of Indonesian philosophical discourse. And I think that we need to remember, Sam, if you agree that in Indonesia, there is the formally recognized official religions and also belief, right, that people have. So it's important to have a book that doesn't just go from the, typical Abrahamic or Judeo-Christian or even Islamic type of thinking, but also a more, I would say, like analytical arguments that Opie is presenting in his books. Okay, so now let's dive into the main course. Professor Opie, are you ready?
So yes, I'm ready. Do you want me to use my own slides? I did send in some slides, but I'm quite happy to share my screen if you'd rather I did it that way.
Antinomi team, what's preferable? I think that it's better if you could share it so that you can turn on
Okay,
the
so
slide.
let me try and see if I can.
Take your time. Again, gentle reminder, if you have any question about the book or any of the presentations, feel free to share your questions in the chat column.
Okay, so that's come up. Yes. Okay. Unfortunately, I've put it on the other monitor, so I may not be looking straight into the camera because I'll have to keep an eye on what's over there. Okay, so a few thank yous to begin with. First of all, I'd like to thank Samuel and his team for doing the translation. Just to put this in perspective, so here says 360 copies. There's been about 1,200 copies of the original that have been sold, and it came out in 2006. So that's an amazing achievement, I think. The second thing I'd like to do is to thank Eugen for his kind words. As Eugen said, we go back a long way. We've been friends for a long time. It's been quite a while since we caught up. I think the last time was when he invited me to present at a conference in Birmingham, but that was way back before COVID. It's great to, whenever I have a chance, to catch up with him. Okay, so I was asked to say some things about the book. And so what I will do is roughly on the following plan. I've got some general comments to make, and I want to say something about the views about argument that were kind of operating in the book. Then I'm going to say what the main claim of the book is, because the book does have a thesis. And then I'll say something about the various parts of the book. That might be too much. I think I'm only supposed to talk for about 40 minutes. So if I'm going on too long, just tell me to stop. Okay, so the English version was published in 2006, and it was the sort of accumulation of about 14 years of work. So I gave a course of lectures at the ANU in 1990 when I'd just finished my PhD and I was kind of unemployed, and they asked me to teach philosophy of religion. And I gave 26 lectures on arguments about the existence of God. And I had this very big manuscript at that point. And it just sat there for a long time. And then in about, I guess about 2004, I started actually trying to turn it into a book and added lots of new material into it. Of course, my thinking's developed in lots of different ways since I wrote the book. And I'll say something about that in some of the future discussion. It's not that I disagree with a whole lot that's in the book, but there's lots that I'd want to add. And one important point to note is that there are lots of new arguments that have appeared since 2004. And of course, none of them are discussed in the book. Some of them I've discussed in print, though not very many. There's others that I've discussed at least on one of my appearances on somebody's channel on YouTube. Okay, so that's it for the general remarks. So about argument assessment. There are two initial questions to ask about any argument that's presented to you, governed by the intention to change your mind about the conclusion of the argument. One question is whether the conclusion is sufficiently supported by the premises, and the other question is whether you believe all of the premises. If you're presented with an argument and it's got a premise that you don't accept, then that's it for that argument, right? You just say, I don't believe that premise, and that's the end. Now, my book would have been much shorter if I'd taken that approach and I just, for each of the arguments, said, okay, I don't believe that premise, I don't believe that premise, I don't believe that premise. I could have written a very short book. What I tried to do in arguing about gods was think about all the different perspectives that someone might bring to the argument and think about all the different challenges that you could make to each of the premises in the argument. That's why it's such a big book, because it considers lots and lots of things. There's different ways so that it will be inclusive, so that perhaps no matter who you were, you could see whether there was some objection to this argument that you ought to be taking seriously. Whatever you do in thinking about arguments, you have to worry about support. In many cases, the question about support is just a question about whether the conclusion's a logical consequence of the premises. And there, so long as we're clear enough about what the premises are, it's fairly straightforward to assess whether the argument's valid or not. And there are some arguments like Anselm's Proslogion 2 argument where the argument's sufficiently fuzzy that it's really not clear whether we want to say that it's valid or not. But in general, we can usually sort out, right? We might have some residual disputes about what are the true principles of logic and things like that. But in general, philosophers pretty quickly sort out whether a conclusion is supported by given premises. So what's left in the assessing of arguments is really going to be related to this question about what you can reasonably believe in connection with the premises. So that brings me to my main claim. So the thesis of arguing about gods is that there are no successful arguments for any of the following claims. There is a God, there's no God, there's compelling reason to suspend judgment between 1 and 2. Right? There are no successful arguments for any of those claims. It's rationally permissible, given all of the arguments made to date, to believe there is a God or to believe there's no God or to suspend judgment whether there is a God. So while I am an atheist, the thesis of the book is not particularly an atheistic thesis. You can agree with this thesis whether you're a theist, an atheist, or an agnostic. Of course, you can also disagree with it, whether you're a theist, an atheist, or an agnostic, but that's the thesis. That's the claim that I was trying to defend in the course of the book. And I occasionally come across people who agree with me. So there is that. Okay, I'm going to say a little bit about what I think about the various arguments that I talk about in the book. So essentially what I'm going to do is explain for a whole lot of arguments a reason or two why you shouldn't think that this was a successful argument. This wasn't an argument that should make everybody accept its conclusion on pain of irrationality. I will assume a little bit of familiarity with some of the arguments, and I apologise if what I'm saying doesn't make sense to you because you don't know enough about the background. So I've already mentioned Proslogion 2. I think that Anselm's argument there relies on a Meinongian background. It relies on this idea that there's a distinction between what exists and what's real. Anselm himself talks about what exists in reality and what exists in the understanding, but existence in the understanding is what corresponds in the standard Meinongian terminology to being real. And I think that because, and I should say, Brian Lefto's recently written a book called Anselm's Argument, in which he says very clearly that he thinks that Anselm's a Meinongian. So it's not like this. I mean, maybe this is still controversial, but there are serious scholars who think that this is right. I think that once you recognize that the background to the argument is Meinongian, you can see that there's no chance that the argument is going to be persuasive. It will be fine for Anselm to think that his argument is sound. It's fine for him to think the premises are true. But it's not the Meinongian background that guarantees that, right? It's independently his theism that he's relying on in order to get to the truth of the premises. So some of you will know that colleague of Anselm's produced a parallel argument for the existence of an island than which no greater island can be conceived. And the way that Anselm argued about his own case was, look, when you hear the words that than which no greater can be conceived, you understand them. That means they exist in the understanding. But part of the what's entailed in being that than which no greater can be conceived is that you exist in reality. So you have to understand that that than which no greater can be conceived exists in reality. And that just means that it must, right? It has to exist in reality. And Gornillo says, well, no, look, the island of which no greater island can be conceived, you understand those words, it exists in the understanding. If it's that island in which no greater can be conceived, existence in reality is a great making property for it. So it too exists in reality, but the problem is we know there's no such island. Something's gone wrong. Okay, now that seems to me to be, whatever you think about the particular example of the island, the general strategy is obviously going to work. And so it's going to turn out that while Anselm can reasonably believe the argument's sound, he's got no justification whatsoever for thinking that the fool ought to be persuaded by this argument. Right, the fool's got just as much reason to think that there really is an island in which no greater island can be conceived. Okay, that's Anselm's argument very quickly. In Meditation 5, Descartes produces a different argument. There's lots of scholarly contention about exactly what the argument is and indeed whether he had an argument at all. But if he had an argument, it goes like this. God's a being that has every perfection. Existence is a perfection. So God has existence. What that is, God exists. I think that this argument, the problematic part of this argument is the first premise and its status. God has all of the perfections. Now, one thing you might say is that's just true as a matter of definition, right? We're just going to define God to be the being that has all of the perfections. But what that means is that really we should write the premise this way, according to the definition. God has all of the perfections, and the conclusion that would follow from that is God, according to the definition, God exists. But just because the definition says it so doesn't mean it is, right? You can define words however you like. So that can't be that way the argument won't work. The alternative is just to insist, no, the premise was God has all the perfections. Okay, now, is that true? What if there's no God? Is it true? Right? Consider a different case. Consider Superman flies. Is that true? If it was true, surely you could infer that someone flies, but we know that nobody does. Presumably, therefore, it's false. And the reason why it's false is because there's no such thing as Superman. Go back to God has all the perfections. If you don't believe in God, you're just going to think that's false because there is no God. And so that argument can't possibly persuade you either. Okay. Now, there are other ways you can go with understanding Superman flies. You might think, there's a sense in which that's true. It's true because the stories say it's true, right? It's not that there really is a Superman, but the fiction makes that true. Well, you could, obviously the atheist or the agnostic can say the same thing about God has all the perfections. That's made true by religious texts of one kind or another, but still there isn't a God, right? It's not that there's a God that makes it true. And so in the relevant sense, the argument's still not going to go through. Strictly speaking, there's a sort of, according to the texts, God has all of the perfections, and all that will follow is, well, according to the text, God exists. You won't get out the conclusion that God really does exist from that argument either. Okay. Third type of ontological argument, modal ontological arguments. So there's been a huge amount written about these in the last 60 years or so. So think of the argument like this. It's possible that God exists. Necessarily, if God exists, it's necessary that God exists. Therefore, God exists. Assume the right modal logic and the argument's valid. What's the problem with this argument? Well, suppose you're an atheist, right? And we're supposing that necessarily, if God exists, then it's necessary that God exists. So you think it's impossible that God exists. That's what you have to think. So go back to the argument, start with, it's possible that there's no God. Necessarily, if God exists, it's necessary that God exists, so God doesn't exist, right? Similar argument, but from the opposing point of view, it looks like the argument that's sound. It's clear that neither of these arguments gives any leverage. Neither of them can compel everybody to go one way or the other. So that argument doesn't succeed, right? Any more than the argument for atheism based on the possibility that God doesn't exist succeeds. Last kind of ontological argument, Gödel's argument. Okay, so Gödel's argument is the example of a higher order argument. It talks about properties. In particular, the idea is that some properties are perfections. So what Gödel assumes is that perfections are properties that satisfy two conditions. First of all, if a property F is a perfection, nothing that is F is also not F, right? Sorry, I've said the wrong thing. If F is a perfection, then not F can't be a perfection. If existing is a perfection, then not existing is definitely not a perfection as well. Okay, so that's the first axiom for Gödel's argument. If a property is a perfection, its negation is not a perfection. The other axiom is if you've got some perfections, a bunch of properties, any property that's entailed by them is also a perfection, right? So as Gödel says it, the perfections are closed under entailment. Okay, now what we're going to do from those two assumptions is show that the perfections are possibly instantiated. It's possible that there's something that has all of the perfections. And then we're just going to use a modal ontological argument to get the conclusion that God exists. Right. Suppose that you're not a theist. Suppose that you're an agnostic or an atheist. Then it's not just that you're going to think that there's nothing that's, let's suppose, omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good and sole creator of everything else, but you're going to think that it's impossible that there's anything that has all of those properties. That's for the same reason that we saw about what you're going to say about the modal ontological argument. So you're going to think that there's some properties, maybe all of them. Maybe you think that it's impossible for anything to be omnipotent, anything to be omniscient, anything to be perfectly good. But you're going to have to think that at least one of them is impossible. So suppose you think that it's impossible that anything is omniscient. Okay, suppose that a property is impossible. Then, by classical logic, it entails all other properties. So in particular, it entails its negation. Right? So if omnipotence or omniscience, whichever one I picked, is impossible, then omniscience or omnipotence, whatever it is, entails not being omnipotent, not being omniscient. And so it fails the first one of the two conditions that were the starting point for the proof that it's possible that there's something that has those properties. So you had to be assuming from the beginning, in order, when you assumed that the perfection satisfied those two conditions, you are already assuming that they're possibly instantiated. And then you went through this reasoning to get to the conclusion that it's possible that they're jointly instantiated, which means that essentially you assumed what you set out to prove, right? And I think it's quite transparent that that's what Gödel's argument does. So that's what's wrong with it from point of view. Okay, we'll keep on going. Cosmological arguments. I'm going to only discuss two. I'm going to divide all the cosmological arguments in two. I want to say something about Aquinas's arguments and then something about all the rest. So when I wrote arguing about gods, Alex Proust wrote a review. I think it was probably in the I've forgotten the name of the name of the journal that carries lots and lots of book reviews. And he argued that the treatment of Aquinas's 5 ways in the book was slightly subpar. And I think I agree with him about that, sort of. It was kind of a deliberate choice on my point for a reason that I'll explain. So the main thing I wanted to argue was that, strictly speaking, I really spend most time thinking about the first 3 of the 5 ways. They're invalid. The conclusions simply don't follow as a consequence of the premises in any of those arguments. And I still think that's right. I recently published a paper about the first way in a Portuguese journal in which I spell this out in excruciating detail. to make the case that the argument really is invalid. What's true, if you think about the first way, the argument from change or motion, or however you want to think about it, is that you can get out a very weak conclusion from Aquinas's premises. You can get out the conclusion that there are first movers or first changes. You can't get out the conclusion that there's exactly one, and you can't get out the conclusion that anything about them, that there must be such a thing, so that you get sort of in other possible worlds, there's got to be at least one first change or first mover. You can't get that out either. So you only get out a very weak conclusion, which seems way too weak to justify the claim that this is what everybody calls God. Never mind if you're trying to justify the claim that it's pure act or something like that. Now, there is the thing that I didn't talk about in the book that I should have talked about is the kind of standard Thomistic idea that when we're talking about causal chains, we, in the context of the first way or the second way, we should make a distinction between per se causal chains and per accidens causal chains, and it's the former rather than the latter that Aquinas is talking about. This is absolutely irrelevant to the validity of the argument, because the validity of the argument is a formal matter, and the text only talks about causes. It nowhere mentions the distinction between per se causes and per accidens causes. Why didn't I discuss this distinction in the book? Because I think that it's very unhelpful to Aquinas's cause to take him to be thinking about per se causal series in the context of the first way. So the first way starts off with, it's obvious to observation that there are things that cause other things, right? It's obvious that there's causing going on. It's obvious to perception, you can see it. Right. Now think about the kinds of per se causal chains that you can see. So I'll just give you some of the standard Thomistic examples. So here's one. There's a man who's holding a stick, and the man's moving, the stick's moving, it's moving a ball, the ball's rolling along the ground. If the man stops walking, the stick stops moving, the ball stops moving, right? So the only thing that's sort of providing input here is the man. Question, what's moving the man? Answer, nothing, right? He's a self-mover. Is he God? No. So this argument terminates at a point that doesn't get you to God, right? Different example. Think about, I mean, this is not an example that Aquinas would have used, but contemporary Thomists will. You're standing at a railway crossing. There are some carriages going past. Each carriage is being pulled along by the one that's immediately ahead of it, right? You know, somewhere up ahead, there's an engine and it's doing all of the work. All of the carriages in this per se sequence are moving only because the engine's moving. Is it God? No, but there's nothing pulling it, right? There's nothing moving it. In the same sense, right? It's not going to get you to God. Okay, third example. Think about a tower of blocks, bricks, stacked up. The bottom one is holding the ones above it. The next one's holding all the ones above it, and so on. They're being held up by the earth. What's holding up the earth? Answer, that doesn't even make sense, right? Doesn't even make sense to ask that question. There's nothing that's holding up the earth. Is the earth God? No, it's not, right? The problem's clear. We're supposed to be able to see by observation a sequence of this kind that leads to God. But every time you pick a sequence, it doesn't get you there. So that was the reason why I didn't talk about it in the book, because I thought this is obviously a non-starter as a way of arguing for the existence of God, to go this way. Now, there are people, Ed Fazer, for example, recently has tried to run a version of an argument which he thinks is like the first way, in which he appeals to unification of essence and existence. Now, I defy you to point me to an example where I can see that happening, where it's obvious to perception that there's some unification of essence and existence going on, right? What's going on there is a kind of very arcane bit of metaphysical theorizing that you might suppose you're going to rely on if you think that, you know, if you reify essence and existence in a way that I'm not, and lots of other people are not inclined to do. But it can't fit the demands of the first way, right? It's just not obvious it's not obvious in any sense that that bit of arcane metaphysics is true and exemplified in the world. Okay, so that was what's going on with Aquinas. In hindsight, I wish I'd said all of the stuff that I just said now, so that it was there in the book. It would have spared me the pain of a large amount of criticism that I got subsequently. Okay, all the other cosmological arguments, Kalam arguments, contingency arguments, first cause arguments that are not interpreted in the Thomistic style and so on. What I want to say about those is that almost always the proper conclusions of those arguments can be affirmed by atheists and they can be affirmed by agnostics too. So suppose you think that there's causal history is finite and there's a necessary first cause. Right? Some theists have thought that. But naturalists can think that too. They can just think that the initial state of the universe is necessary. Suppose you think that there's a first moment in time in which things happen, right? And then what you want to say is that what happens at that point in time is whatever you want to say about it, contingent, necessary, or whatever. Theists and atheists can have the same range of options. There's nothing here that insists that the kind of temporal origin has to rest with God rather than with something natural. And what have I left out? The contingency argument. You've got to start with something necessary. You can think that the first stage of the universe is necessary, right? So typically, the first stage of cosmological arguments doesn't get you to something that atheists and agnostics can't also believe. And so it's not an effective argument for the existence of God. Typically, there are also problems with the further argument that's given that's supposed to get you from that thing to the divine attributes, but I'm not going to worry about that here. I mean, because I think that the most important point to note is that these kinds of arguments are clearly not going to be ones that are going to force convergence of opinion on the existence of God. Okay, how long have I got? Got a little bit longer, or have I just about used up all the time?
I think you still have plenty.
Plenty, okay.
Plenty.
Design arguments. So these are more controversial. I've recently written a paper that's coming out in a book that Paul Russell is publishing on Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion. And he asked me to write something about design arguments in the context of the dialogues. And so I argue that Hume actually gives a compelling case against design arguments in the dialogues. And he largely gives the case, though not entirely, to Philo. The most important thing is this. If we think about what ultimately is the source of order in the world, or if you're thinking about the fine-tuning, about the very specific features of the nature of the world. And Philo says at one point, I think it's in part 7, it's somewhere around there, if we're going to suppose that somewhere order is just intrinsic to something, we should suppose that it's intrinsic to the universe rather than supposing that it's intrinsic to God. Because either way, we're making the supposition that it's intrinsic. And if you postulate God, you've postulated an extra thing that you didn't need to postulate. And I think that that's right in the following sense. If you're trying to make a design argument to convince atheists or agnostics, they're rightly going to say, no, I'm quite happy where I am. From my point of view, believing in God will be completely unnecessary. Okay, so let me illustrate this in the case of the fine-tuning. So some people think that there are various fundamental physical constants which are such that had they varied even very slightly, the universe as we know it would not have existed. Either the universe would have collapsed in on itself in a tiny fraction of a second, or blown apart enormously quickly, and forever there would have been nothing essentially but empty space and an occasional blip of radiation. The universe that we know requires the constants to be in a very specific range. So the physicists tell us, let's not disagree with them about that. Instead, let's ask this question. In causal reality, when were the values of the constants fixed? There are two possibilities. Either they're fixed from the get-go, right? There's an initial state and they're fixed there, or they're not fixed up until a certain point and then they become fixed. Now, in that second case, what must be going on is that there's some indeterministic transition, right? It's just chance that fixes the values in that second case. And you could believe that whether you're a theist or an atheist, right? I don't think that that's the way the physics goes. I think the way the physics goes, it says the values are there from the beginning. Okay, so now what are the possibilities? Well, we've already discussed beginnings. If you're an atheist or an agnostic and you think the beginning is necessary, then you're just going to think the values of the constants are necessary. It just falls out of your general theory. If you're a theist, you might think, so we're asking the same question now about God. God wants the values to be a certain way. Is that necessary or contingent? Could God have wanted them to go a different way, right? If it's necessary, fine. If it's contingent, well, that will be comparable, and you think there's a huge range of different ways that God could have made the constants, then you can think the same thing about the universe, right? Instead of a necessary origin, it's just brutally contingent, and there's all these other ways it could have gone, right? So the point that emerges is no matter which way you go, people will be happy sitting where they are. Atheists and agnostics can give the same kind of answer that the theists can give, and the design argument just doesn't cut any ice one way or the other, right? So the argument's unsuccessful. Okay, so that was design arguments. There's, as with all the other arguments, there's lots of details I'm skipping, but that's all right. On to the other side, on to evil. So I argue, because it's part of my general project, that no arguments from evil are successful. None as such as ought to convert people from theism to atheism. So I think that logical arguments from evil always contain premises that reflective, informed theists reject, right? So the way the argument goes is you theists have this set of beliefs, but look, they're jointly inconsistent. You ought to give up believing in God. So think about Mackey's famous 1955 argument. Here are two premises in Mackey's argument. A good thing eliminates evil as far as it can, and there are no limits to what an omnipotent being can do. Almost all theists, I know all philosophical theists, reject both of those claims, right? There are at least logical and metaphysical limits to what an omnipotent being can do. And whether a good being eliminates evil as far as it can depends upon whether eliminating sort of residual evil is going to start removing goods from the universe as well. What you want to promote is the best overall balance of good over evil, and that doesn't necessarily mean getting rid of all the evil, right? So both of those claims seem quite reasonable to me. If I was a theist, I would certainly accept them both. So Mackey's argument is just not a good argument against theism. Rowe has two premises, both in his logical argument. So I'm not talking about his empirical argument, I'm talking about his logical argument. There are two premises. They're both controversial. The one that I think is more controversial is the one that says that there are bad states of affairs in the world that God could have prevented without losing some outweighing greater good or permitting other equally bad or worse states of affairs. So lots of atheists and some agnostics, perhaps even some theists, maybe, I don't know, but typically not, think that's true. However, it seems to me that the right way for theists to respond to this, and this is actually what Rowe said in his original 1979 paper, is look, there's that little bit of evidence that doesn't look good, but the total evidence for God is so compelling that it outweighs worries about evil. It must be that God has some reason for permitting the Holocaust, even though I've got no idea what it might be. And that seems to me to be a perfectly adequate response to Rowe's logical argument from evil. And not only that, as a bonus, it kind of tells you how to respond to any empirical arguments that are supposed to be empirical arguments against theism. What matters is the total evidence, and you have to weigh everything up. And even if there's some bit of evidence that looks like it's quite weighty evidence against your view, it can be outweighed by everything else. So you can think on balance, the evidence points to God. You can also think on balance, it doesn't. On balance, it's a wash and we should be agnostics, whatever. Right, that's kind of part of my general view. Okay, so that was arguments from evil. Pascal's wager. This is a small part of the book, but it's one of the fun bits. So I did want to say something about this too. So the way that Pascal's wager is usually presented, it goes like this. There's a pair of actions you need to choose between, believing in God or not believing in God. There's two ways the world can be, God exists or God doesn't. There'll be some non-zero probability you give to God's existing, and then there'll be some values for each of the pairs of action and way the world might be. And the only one that's infinite is you believe and God exists. You get an infinite reward because you go to heaven. And it's important that it's believing, right? That's what gets rewarded. In Pascal's original version, he's very clear about this, right? It's the faithful, the people who believe, who get rewarded. And so kind of maybe you're not just believing that God exists isn't enough to guarantee the reward, but it's clearly necessary for it. Okay, problem with this version of the argument is that belief's not an action you can perform at will. You can't just choose to believe anything. Try it out. Try believing that there's a Siberian tiger in the room with you. Right now, just looking at people that I can see, none of you are succeeding in believing it because none of you are panicking and running for the door or anything like that, right? It's belief just isn't subject to the will in that kind of way. And this has been recognised in the literature for quite a while because since about 2002, people have stopped framing the wager argument when they're trying to defend it in terms of believing and have instead started framing it in terms of wagering, where we can understand wagering as something like this: setting out on whatever course of action you think is most likely to lead you to belief, right? So same setup as before, except now we've got wager, not wager, God exists, God doesn't exist, some probability, and an infinity for wagering and God. But that's a mistake, right? Wagering doesn't guarantee success. I might wager and fail to end up believing. Equally, I might not wager and end up believing, right? And maybe there's some probabilities for each of those. When you factor that into account, it turns out that the expected utility of wagering and non-wagering each come out to be infinite. They come out to be the same. And so the wager calculation doesn't recommend any particular course of action. Now, I think this belief versus wager dilemma is actually crippling to Pascal's wager. Right? I mean, I know there are people some people who thought that maybe belief is sort of subject to the will in the right kind of way. That seems really improbable to me. And what I definitely think is that most atheists and agnostics are not going to believe that. And it's hard to see how to avoid the problem once you've moved to wagering, unless you change your views about what God rewards, and you think that it's enough if you, as I would think, well, what's the most likely way for me to end up believing in God? Nothing recommends itself, just go on as I'm doing, but call me a wagerer, right? And that doesn't seem very satisfactory either. Okay, so that's the first point. Second point I'll make is about many gods objections. It's very easy to underestimate the force of the many gods objections to Pascal's wager. Pascal wasn't arguing that mere belief that there's a God would get you into heaven. You had to become one of the faithful. In particular, you had to accept all of the beliefs of the Jansenists in particular, right? Those other people, the Catholics, or sorry, not the Catholics, the Calvinists and the Lutherans, they were damned, right? Because they had the wrong beliefs, right? So think about it this way. There's quite a range of options here. There are many different kinds of Christianity. There's a decent number of different kinds of Islam. There are actually a few different kinds of Judaism. There are theistic versions of Hinduism. What's the recommendation here that's going to guarantee you salvation? And why should you believe that? It's very hard to think that there's a particular wager on a particular sect within one of the world religions that somehow stands out. It's got a kind of bright, shiny light around it that says, I'm the one you should pick, right? So that's another reason for thinking that Pascal's wager is not looking very attractive. Okay. Samuel mentioned at the beginning that there are lots of other arguments that are discussed in arguing about gods. One thing I'll say is that you can infer my view about lots of the other arguments from other things that I've written, in particular from what I say in the little book, Is There a God?, that I co-wrote with Kenny Pierce that came out a couple of years ago. I thought I might discuss one other case, the argument from psychophysical harmony, which has been doing the rounds recently. So some people think that somehow or other there's this remarkable harmonization that needs to be done in order to get your brain states to line up with the kind of motivational aspect of what it's like to be in those states. I think that at the very least, if you're an identity theorist, there is no problem here for you because there is no lining up that needs to be done. There's just one thing that has these two different aspects that can't be pulled apart as separate existences. There is a distinction here in reason, but there's no distinction in reality, right? To borrow some old scholastic terminology and put it to a useful application here. So there's a lot more to say about the argument from psychophysical harmony, but I think it's kind of obvious that there's no problem there if, like me, you're a kind of Jack Smart style identity theorist. Okay. Last set of remarks. And this is quite important too. When I wrote Arguing About Gods, I thought that discussing arguments was the most important part of philosophy of religion. So, I mean, that was something that's how I came to philosophy of religion. I was told to teach a course about arguments about the existence of God. And I spent a very long time, maybe 15 years, just working on arguments about the existence of God for the most part. I'm no longer convinced that that's right. I think that it's much more important to think about theories than it is to think about arguments. So these are two different theoretical entities. An argument is a set of claims, one of which is distinguished as the conclusion, the rest of which are distinguished as the premises. A theory is a set of claims that's closed under logical consequence. So none of the claims is distinguished, but if something's a logical consequence of claims in the theory, it will also be in the theory. Of course, our beliefs are not closed under logical consequence, but our commitments are, right? So long as you're consistent, you're committed to the logical consequences of the things that you believe. If you're not consistent, we're talking about classical logic, things get messy. There are ways around it. I'm trying to avoid any technical details here, so let's not worry about that. What I think is much more interesting to think about in the context of philosophy of religion is the theories that people have, and in particular, learning about the theories that other people have, right? And that's what we should be focused primarily on, not on arguments designed to try to get people to believe the theory that we're currently at. There is a kind of theoretical argument for the relative greater importance of theories over arguments, which is this. If I've got a theory, you can immediately predict for any argument that's valid, whether or not I'm going to think it's sound. You just have to look to see whether I accept all the claims or not, right? So moreover, if you've got a theory, you know that pick any claim in the theory, there's going to be like infinitely many arguments that have that claim as conclusion and other things that you believe as premises. And of course, lots of them are not going to look like compelling arguments, but you're sure going to think they're all sound, right? We can't work in the opposite direction. You can't start from the arguments, collect the arguments that you think are sound, and then infer back from that to the theory that you accept, right? This is a sort of practical point. We can't formulate our beliefs in that way, right? Starting from the arguments and working back to get to the theories. In principle, if I knew all of the arguments that would be judged sound, given your theory and assuming that you're consistent, I could figure out what your theory is, right? But only in principle. In practice, I couldn't do that, and we don't work that way, right? So I think that it's a mistake to be fixated on arguments rather than thinking about theories. This doesn't mean that I think that kind of arguing about gods no longer has any value, right? There are various reasons. One is because people are, despite what I've just said, people are going to go on producing these arguments forever, and there'll be people trying to persuade one another with them. And so it's important, whoever you are, whatever your position is, that you at least have the resources to respond to the arguments that come your way that are trying to move you somewhere else. And aside from that, there's just the kind of historical tradition. There are 2,000 years of people producing these arguments. We'd like to have some accounting for them that doesn't get forgotten. Right? So while, as the work that I've done in the last 10 years or so indicates, I've become persuaded that there are other areas where it's better to direct our attention, there was some value in the thing that I did when I wrote Arguing About Gods. That's it. So I'll stop screen sharing.
Thank you, Professor Opie. That is a very enlightening, explanations of the book. I think it's really helpful for those who wants to study about philosophy of religion to look at all this list of arguments and see the inconsistencies and also the challenges that might be posed. So we're gonna open the session to the audience, but some questions from me, Professor Opie. I think that it's really interesting to look at all this ontological, logical arguments. Take Anselm, for example, right? God is the perfection, and there exists nothing that could be better than God. And I think that one challenge was posed by a French monk, Gonilo, who kind of used this like reductio ad absurdum type of challenge, where he said that that argument could be applied to an island, for example, but it would be considered nonsense because anyone could just make up an island that is more excellent, right? And then Anselm comes back saying that no, we cannot compare an island to God because God has a no intrinsic maximum, right? So I think that's an interesting kind of response. So what do you think about kind of this, like, I wouldn't say shortcut, but kind of attempt to stop this never-ending type of sequence? For example, the way Anselm posed this no intrinsic maximum concept.
Right. So the kind of no intrinsic maximum idea is often associated with Plantinga. So he pressed this reply quite a bit. So let's go back to the first step in the argument. You hear the words island in which no greater island can be conceived, or that being in which no greater being can be conceived. And according to Anselm, you understand it, right? Do we understand it in both cases? Is that what the objection is here? That we really don't understand island in which no greater island can be conceived? Because if what we're required to do is to probe into the concept, right, and see whether there's some hidden inconsistency in it, then, and if we think that there is a hidden inconsistency, then we really don't understand it, then lots of agnostics and atheists straight off are going to say, well, no, I didn't understand that than which no greater can be conceived. It's impossible that there's any such thing. There's kind of metaphysical inconsistency, if you like, buried there to start with. Right. So it's not clear that this is really a good strategy. It needs a lot of spelling out, because we need to know what's going on when we're making that judgment about whether we understand these words or not. Right. That right at the very beginning of the argument. Anyway, so there's way more to say. It's a huge and interesting topic. I really like I mean, it's kind of obvious, Gornillo's objection and the vast literature that's been spanned by it. So, yeah.
Awesome. So let's open up the session to the audience. Just a reminder that all questions should be submitted in the chat column. No open mic. Sorry about that. So let me take a look at.
Eugen raised his hand.
Eugen, go ahead. Yeah.
Let him ask a question.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Good. Yeah. So towards the end, you said that it might not be necessarily important to address these arguments for and against the existence of God, and you said that you are now thinking that it's more important to talk about theories. And then at some point you talked about total evidence. But then I was thinking, if you consider atheism and theism as theories, and if you try to consider total evidence, then isn't it important to address these arguments for and against the existence of God? Because, for example, the fine-tuning of the universe, or the apparent design of the universe, or whatever, or the existence of evil, these are evidence against theism or atheism as theories. So it still seems important to address these arguments.
So that's kind of interesting. I'm not sure that's right, because there's stuff here that we can agree is relevant evidence, right? So there's this, assuming that the universe is fine-tuned, then whatever your total theory is, there's a question about what you say about that bit of evidence. Whether that could be turned into an interesting argument seems doubtful to me, but it really matters that if we're thinking about the comparing the theories and thinking that we're going to do it roughly in the way I recommend. So we think about the relative simplicity, comparative simplicity of the two theories, and then comparatively how well they explain various things. Now you might think, okay, that's going to result in an argument in the end, but that's not my view, because my view is that the assessment of the total evidence and the assessment of the sort of comparative complexity of the positions is so complicated that inevitably it's a matter for judgments all over the place. And I think, though lots of people disagree, that we can end up in different places. It's rationally permissible to make, to hold any of a huge range of total theories. Right. So I don't think that you can turn it into an argument because it's too complicated to do it.
Well, maybe what I mean is not that we will eventually have this big overall argument about total evidence, but just quickly, because I know there are a lot of other questions, but we read Paul Draper's book manuscript recently, and he talks about total evidence as well, and he wants to assess the intrinsic probability of theism and atheism, and looking at the overall evidence, which one is more plausible or more likely as a correct theory. But what he does is almost to go through all arguments against the existence of God and for the existence of God, and assess them as evidence for or against the existence of God. And his overall conclusion is that none of these theistic arguments are compelling, and given the the existence of evil in the world, it's more likely than not that atheism is true. And so your
that's
approach
not
is
quite
very...
that's not quite right, though. I mean, he argues against agential theism, but he, as you know, he argues for a kind of that it's an open question about cosmo-panpsychism. So he's actually an
Right, yeah,
agnostic.
that's yes. There's a strange chapter at the end which he decided to drop. But he, at one point he said
Oh,
that
did he drop that chapter?
he just told me only a couple of days ago, because I said that maybe it's a good idea to drop it because people might not take his atheism, his argument for atheism very seriously if he has a little bit. I mean, I like cosmopsychism because I like weird theories, but people might find it a little bit weird. And
So, okay, so a little bit of information. There's supposed to be a book of replies to Draper coming out.
Oh
And I
yes,
haven't
I'm
been
contributing as well.
right, and I haven't been notified yet that my essay is going to be deleted because it's all about his last chapter. So I
Oh
should
yeah,
get some.
mine as well. But it doesn't have to be a response to the book itself, so it's still fun. We can talk about it.
Yeah, so I think so it depends, right? If your assessment of, say, the fine tuning was that it gave some huge advantage to theism, that still wouldn't make it a necessarily give, even if they accepted it, wouldn't give agnostics and atheists a reason to change their mind. Because it depends upon how they assess all the rest of the evidence. They might think that the rest of it adds up to something that outweighs that. So it's not clear what you would be claiming about those arguments that would be of interest, right? Or that would run against my thesis that there are no successful arguments on any side.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gasawa and Professor Opie. Let's hear from the audience, from AJ. Question for Dr. Opie. Many philosophers see arguing about gods as one of the best critics of natural theology or arguments for atheism, and a natural sequel to Mackey's Miracle of Theism and Sobel's Logic and Theism. Can you speak about how Mackey and Sobel's work influenced your cumulative critique of arguments for theism?
Okay, so Mackey's book was enormously influential on me. When I was an undergraduate, I took a course with Bruce Langtry, and we had two texts, The Miracle of Theism and Swinburne's The Existence of God. And those two books had an enormous influence. I mean, you can see their continuing influence into the present. As somebody, it might have been Eugene, I can't remember now, said in the introductory remarks, Mackey, no, maybe it was Samuel. I mean, Mackey's book's quite old now. It appeared in 82, and there's an enormous amount of work that's been done by theists producing new arguments since 1982. And so by the time we got to 2006, there was clearly room for an update on Mackey. I guess in many ways my views are quite similar to Mackey's, but not on everything. I think that I'm more sympathetic to certain kinds of speculative metaphysics than Mackey was. He's probably more of an old-fashioned empiricist than me. So Bell's book was too late to really, I mean, it came out about the same time, but I think my book might already have been in press because it took a long time for it to come out by the time that Sobel's book came out. So it didn't influence arguing about gods. I do have a paper that I published in Philo, a long paper where I criticised a whole lot of stuff in Sobel's book. I certainly didn't agree with him about everything. But I do think his book's very impressive, but it's much more limited in scope than Mackey's book. It takes on a much smaller range of topics. And I think some of the treatment, the kind of setting out of the arguments in full dress, you know, the derivations in classical logic is a bit of overkill, really. I mean, his book could have been shorter and less complicated and without losing any of its punch. I do think that it's a really good book overall. So that's my view about Sobel. Do I have plans to revise Arguing About Gods? Probably not. Just because there's a whole bunch of other things that I'd like to do. And one thing I'd really like to do is to write a history of atheism, a kind of global history of atheism in the second millennium. And that will take me years and years to do that, but that will be fun. So I might do that instead.
Awesome. Looking forward to that. Sam, I think you've posed a number of questions here. Why don't you take the mic as one of our speakers?
Oh yeah. Thank you, Ida. I just want to ask about. So it's an impressive book, Professor RP again, and it's just a simple question, some personal questions. So, what do you think for students? How can we engage in philosophy of religion effectively? And do you have any tips you can share from your experience writing this? And if you want to add, if you were to add something to this book, what argument would you like to discuss? So yeah, those two questions.
So I'll take the second question first. So I would certainly discuss the argument from psychophysical harmony because it's a kind of very recent argument that's been quite widely discussed. I would have a whole lot more stuff about the Kalam cosmological argument on the Grim Reaper arguments. I would have a whole lot more on arguments about contingency, taking into account the Proust and Rasmussen book. There'd be a whole lot of other stuff of Josh Rasmussen's that I would take into account as well if I was doing the book now. You kind of look at the period from now, 2024 to 2004, over that 20-year period, there's lots of interesting material that lots of really smart theists have produced. Another thing that I would say a lot more about is kind of Thomistic arguments. I would like to talk about David Oderberg's work on the first and second ways and the relevant metaphysics, as well as other Feeser's work on that as well. So there's lots and lots of stuff if I was to revise the book that would end up in it. On the first question about how to sort of effectively how to do philosophy of religion. So the way that I learned to do philosophy was just by reading an enormous amount and thinking about it. And I had teachers, and whenever they mentioned something that they thought was worth reading, I would go away and read it. So when I was an undergraduate, I think that it takes, I mean, it varies. There are some people who just seem to be good at philosophy immediately and kind of intuitively understand how to put together a philosophical case for something. I don't think I was like that. It took me a long time. I had to work at it quite a bit. But summing it up in brief, read a lot, think a lot, and talk to lots of people, as many people as you can, right? Try to get across the different points of view that are out there. And of course, while you're doing that, you need to be developing your own views, but that won't necessarily come quickly. It might take you a long time before you start carving out a distinctive theory of your own. I don't know, is that helpful? Eugen might have a different view. Maybe he might want to say something about that.
Eugen, anything to add?
Did you want to me to add to that? About what? How advice for younger people?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I always like these big philosophical questions. I love the philosophy religion mainly because I like the big questions in philosophy about the origin of the universe, the possibility of the existence of God, the possibility of immortality, the problem of evil, and so on. So I always start with these big questions, and then I try to read. I mean, Graham's work is very helpful because, once William Lane Craig was saying that Graham is a scary smart because he can, assess every complex arguments and immediately find gaps in the arguments. And, I found it very helpful to read Graham's work, especially when I was a PhD student, because, it really tells you how you can analyze philosophical arguments in a rigorous way. And also, Graham has a very strong background in the philosophy of language and metaphysics and all of these foundational areas. And it's quite important even if you're interested in philosophy of religion, it's important to study these foundational areas of philosophy, because after all, philosophy of religion is kind of applied metaphysics, applied epistemology, and it's really helpful to read papers by Graham in that respect as well.
Great. So read more foundational works and come up with philosophical arguments and find the gaps. I think it's a really interesting part of religious philosophy. Next question from Robbie Dwigty. It is interesting that you say that you thought the most important part is the argument, but I wonder if you have think about gods or beliefs in terms of daily practices that certain people or certain community have. Simply put, if there's a certain community that have God or belief to bind their social interaction, is it still worth the examination of God in the sense of AAG talk about?
Okay, so I was thinking that argument is important to philosophy, and it's very common for philosophers to think that argumentation is important. There's a whole different question. And we could run this question about philosophy, but we could equally run it about theology too, about ordinary believers and their religious practices and the extent to which theology really matters. So, maybe there are big differences between the world religions in this respect. So there are people who distinguish between religions in which orthodoxy matters and religions in which orthopraxy matters, so that really what matters is the practices. And so sometimes people will say, and I'm not endorsing this, I'm just reporting what some people will say, that that Judaism and Hinduism are much more concerned with practices, whereas Christianity is much more concerned with belief. Right now, that could be just caricature or stereotype or whatever. I'm just noting that that's the point, right? That's a point that some people make. Do I think that everybody should do philosophy or that everybody should do theology? I'm inclined to think not. I think that you can outsource your believing, right? And I think that even philosophers can do this. So in some areas, you can just think, I'm just going to, whatever that person says, they're my guru, right? And I don't see that it's wrong to live your life that way. If you're a philosopher, you find that you can't. There's this itch and you just have to scratch it, right? But people are different, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it reminds me of the conclusion that Pascal, the sentiment that he has is that there's no convincing argumentation either way for or against God, but it's a safe bet to believe that God exists and live accordingly. And it also similar to what Kant said about religion as a moral institution, not like a metaphysical truth. So yeah, I think, do you agree with all those sentiments that it's
So I'm less sure that Pascal really thought that there weren't compelling proofs, but for the sake of argument, or perhaps because the people he really wanted to convince, his young friends who were spending all their time at the backgammon table, right? He wasn't going to persuade them with proofs, even if he thought the proofs ought to be compelling. They weren't going to be compelling for those people, but maybe the wager argument would be, right? You know, if they're spending their time at the backgammon table, maybe they'll appreciate this line of reasoning.
makes sense. Makes sense. Okay, there's another question from Hunter Bizet. One of the more interesting critiques of your take on arguments for the existence and non-existence of gods is that your analysis of what constitutes a successful argument sets the bar too high. Bill Craig has made this point and argued that arguing about gods really supports agnosticism. Similarly, a recent paper published by Beckfee argues that your analysis or arguments rules out any kind of philosophical justification. How do you respond to these charges?
So the recent article in the International Journal of Philosophy of Religion, I think, gets me wrong in various ways. So I haven't written a reply, as in I haven't written a paper in reply, though I did write to the author and say some things. I don't think that setting the bar high for arguments is a bad thing, but you have to remember that what goes along with this is that I'm very permissive about rationality, right? And it's because I'm very permissive about rationality that the bar goes up so high. But it's an advantage of my view, I think that there's a wide range of reasonable opinion, and that sort of going along with that, you shouldn't be disrespectful of the views of others, even when you disagree with them very strongly, because they're quite within they're within the bounds of reason in holding the positions that they do. So that would be the first point that I would want to make. And I think that I would want to say something similar to Bill Craig as well. Like you can, if you set the bar for successful argument much lower than I do, and then you want to criticize people that disagree with you, it's going to be, I think, more or less inevitable that you're going to end up claiming that they're just irrational. And that just seems a sort of an unpleasant position to be taking. Right. So if we're just thinking about the kind of ordinary benefits and costs here, there is something attractive about my position. And that's not I mean, there's a whole lot more to say in epistemology to try to give a direct justification for the position that I'm taking. I mean, there are arguments for and against permissivism about belief. So Roger White has some well-known papers in which he argues that permissivism is just untenable if you've got a body of evidence. Sorry, never mind a body of evidence. If you just think of all the evidence that there is, there's only one rational position, and either you've got it or you don't, right? I mean, there are people who have a kind of intermediate position where for any body of evidence, there's just one thing, but we differ in our evidence. And so there can be some variation in our what is rational for us to believe, but not too much. Whereas I think that when we start thinking about really big bodies of evidence, everything's so complicated that there's a huge range of kind of reasonable positions that we can adopt, bearing in mind that there's so much, we can only attend to a small number of all the things that would really need to be attended to in order to develop a comprehensive theory of everything. I mean, that's just completely beyond us. So there are kind of theoretical reasons maybe they're a bit problematic, but anyway, there are theoretical reasons for wanting to be a permissivist as well, to be highly permissive here.
Okay, since thank you, Professor Opie. I think that we ran out of questions on the chat. So if anyone wants to take the mic, I take it back. You can take the mic. Let's hear some voices. I think there was somebody who wanted to raise their hand. I believe it was Fuad Harahap. Are you still here, Fuad? Oh, I don't think he's here. Yep. Oh, all right.
Yeah, just wanna. Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, I just want publisher as well to Antinomi and all of the editors. So yeah, it's not
Yes.
the work
Sorry, it's
of
all.
a one person, but yeah, it's not a work of one person, but as a collective as well. So the translators, the editors, the publishers. So yeah, cheers to every one of them.
Thank you, Sam. So apparently the audience still cannot open up the mic. So while the administrators take care of that, I think it's interesting, Professor Orpi, that you talk about the variety of the type of rationale that we can accept. And I think that when, for example, we talk about Descartes' triangle analogy and concept, it is a logical necessity to suppose that the triangle has three sides, but it's not a logical necessity to say that it should exist. And I think that's also an interesting nuance that you brought up in the book as well. Somebody speak.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was trying to open my mic, but the administrators haven't allowed it. But for now they already have. So can I ask the question?
Go ahead.
No, okay. First of all, thank you, Mbak Aida. Yeah. Actually, this question is already in some way answered by Professor Opie. But I really want to phrase the question like this. Especially in the case of ontological arguments, why the existence of God is somehow contingent upon the logical validity of the argument. Why can't we make an assertion that God is above logic, or say God exists and that's it? My background is quite a very religious. I had a very religious background. I'm an agnostic, by the way. Whenever I want to try to pose a questions about the existence of God or the arguments for or against God in my religious settings, most people always say something like, "We cannot logic God into existence," or something like that. Now, such question is still haven't really answered in every philosophical literatures that I've ever read, and most of YouTube videos from philosophers. So yeah, that's basically my question. Why can't we just say God is above logic, or say like God is beyond logic, and then move on with our life? Yeah, that's the question.
So it depends. Well, there are different kinds of people with different kinds of religious beliefs and different kinds of things that they want to do with their religious beliefs. So suppose that you belong to one of the religions where there's an imperative to convert other people to the religion, right? So you're an evangelical, if that's the right word. That's not the right word. It's some word. I'm not sure what the word I want is. Religion. So some religions are not like that. I mean, Hinduism really isn't like that. There's not a great drive on the part of Hindus to try to convert people from other nations to Hinduism. Judaism's not really like that either. It's quite hard to become a Jew. It's a very long and onerous process if you're not born a Jew to become a Jew. Whereas there are other religions, and Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity would be three examples, where at least in certain historical periods, they've been very keen to grow their numbers. Now, if you want to grow your numbers, it's not going to be very persuasive if you say to other people, I got nothing. There's nothing I can tell you about why you should believe as we do. Right. So it's kind of understandable, I think, that in contemporary Christianity, there's a big drive to look for persuasive arguments, or more broadly, reasons that you can give to people to convert to Christianity. Right. So that would be part of the reason why, in general, people are not going to take the approach of saying you just can't logic God into existence, right? There's nothing to say here. I'm not sure, that's not a complete account, but maybe that's enough. I mean, you can tell me if you want to hear more.
I believe your answer is enough. Thank you again, Professor. Thank you, Mbak Aida.
Thank you, Fuad. I think we have time for one more question. If anyone wants to take the mic, it's all yours.
Hi, can I respond to Dr. Oppie?
Yes. What's your name?
Hunter.
Hunter. Go ahead, Hunter.
I was the one that had the question about the argument analysis. My follow-up question is, I'm willing to grant that the permissiveness of your analysis may offshoot certain ethical or intellectual virtues with respect to philosophical dialogue. But I didn't hear a direct response to the charge that your analysis seems to make it difficult to apprehend philosophical justification for controversial conclusions. After all, almost everything in philosophy is controversial, but if virtually everything is rational, then virtually nothing is. The concern is that the excessive permissiveness of your view is inflationary in a way that seems to epistemically backfire.
Right. So I guess I don't see that. So why backfire?
Well, to just sort of repeat what I said, if we're willing to say that theists and atheists have these disagreements about arguments about the existence of God, and they're all rational, clearly not everybody's rational.
No, but sorry, that's a kind of misunderstanding. I mentioned at some earlier point, I think in this discussion, the work of people like Mercier and Sperber and Kahneman and Tversky and people like that. Most of us are not rational most of the time, right? So I'm not supposing that rationality in general is easy to achieve, quite the contrary, right? Because we have the best of empirical reasons for thinking that actually most of us are terrible at reasoning a lot of the time. The question is about what to make of a different set of data, namely that when you look at people like David Lewis and Alvin Plantinga, and I could name a few other kind of high-flying philosophers, including some from India and Israel and so on, all around the world, right? That there's no convergence of opinion amongst them, right? And that's the kind of, I mean, I'm going to take it that at least when it comes to their thinking about these matters, they're as rational as people get, right? So it does turn out that there's kind of empirical reason for thinking, right? That the bar is going to have to be set pretty low. There's going to have to be a wide range of views that are rationally permissible to hold, even if it turns out that almost everybody who isn't Plantinga or Lewis or whatever has beliefs that are full of contradictions and awful missteps of one kind or another. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
I think Professor Oppie discussed some non-starters in the beginning of the presentation. All right, thank you, Hunter. If there's any other question from anyone, I think we can still set up some time. We have about 10 minutes left. So if there's any concluding remark from Professor Nagasawa or from Sam, the floor is yours.
Yes, I remember that when Graham wrote the first book on the ontological argument, his plan was to write, many books about different arguments for the existence of God. And I know that he, changed his plan, and he wrote this arguing about God's as a more comprehensive book on various arguments about God. But what I was interested in was, what's your next big project? What kind of big ideas that you're exploring at the moment?
Okay, I'm happy to answer that. I mean, what happened, I spent 3 years working on a book on cosmological arguments, and I realized that it was going to come in at about 1,600 pages if I kept
I
working.
wanted to read that.
And so I abandoned it because there are too many topics. It needed a big amount of attention to time, to causation, to sufficient reason, to infinity. It just was not going to work. And so I could have thought, well, I'll write a series of books, but yeah, it didn't happen. So what am I working on? So for the last 4 years, I've been working on a book on arguing. And it's, so what I've been looking at is things like informal logic, critical thinking, argumentation theory as it appears in a whole lot of different disciplines, and trying to develop a positive account of good arguing, which I think will be, well, the way that it's shaping up, it'll be quite controversial. But anyway, that's what I've been doing. So I haven't been thinking much about philosophy of religion, except for all the refereeing that I do. I haven't been thinking much about philosophy of religion for quite a while. Yeah. And as I said before, when I finish this project, which I hope won't take more than another year or two, I want to write a book about a sort of global history of atheism. But that might be completely beyond my powers. I don't know, but I'll retire and then start doing that.
Awesome. Sam, any concluding remark?
I think again, thanks for Professor Oki and Professor Nagasawa for your time today. It's almost 11 in Oklahoma, so yeah, it's a bit late for Professor Nagasawa here. And thank you, Prof. It's a very impressive book, and cheers again for Antinomi Institute, for Antinomi Publishing, to help us to publish the book, and for print for the second one. And I hope one day probably could have the hard copy of the book. I don't know, but hopefully one day we could give you the hard copy.
So before Eugen goes, I wanted to ask him what he's working on. We should at the moment. So what's your new project?
What I'm working on?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I have just published a book called The Problem of Evil for Atheists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know
I'm
about
sure
that
Graham
one.
will have a lot of criticisms, but and then also I have started to work on a paper for a book in honor of Paul Draper, and I just learned that Graham is writing a paper for that volume as well. And obviously we are both interested in Paul Draper's unusual view called panpsychotheism, which is a kind of cosmopsychist, panpsychist view. So I'm writing many small papers at the moment, but at one point I might write a book on God and consciousness and panpsychism and that kind of topic, because I have written several papers on these topics over the last few years.
So that's sort of going back to your PhD as well.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's kind of I'm going back, and that's partly because I have succeeded a position that was held by Linda Zagzebski, and Linda was also working on the intersection of philosophy of religion and philosophy of mind, and I had some exchange with her, and it kind of motivated me to revisit this topic of God and consciousness.
Yeah, great. That's something to look forward to.
Thank you.
Awesome. And last but not least, Sam, what have you been up to?
Yeah, I'm just doing my master's here, enjoying the beauty of Norman, Oklahoma. So yeah, hopefully next the PhD, but not sure. Let's finish the thing that I have right now here for my master's.
All right, thank you. And that concludes our session for today. Let's give a big round of virtual applause to everybody. Thank you so much for your time this morning and this evening. Feel free to get your copy of the book and keep the conversation going. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank
you,
you
Ida, for
for
Bye.
moderating the session. Bye-bye.
Bye.